The purpose of this interview is to document the experiences of Bangor, Maine resident Galen Cole during World War II. Mr. Cole served from July 18, 1945 to February 4th, 1946, spending in all 18 months in the Army. Our intention is to cover some of these topics. Leaving Maine, being a teenager, living in Maine. We'll talk about basic training, heading to Europe by ship, serving in the 5th Armored Division, near miss in which Mr. Cole was wounded, the end of the war, and duties after the war.
Munster,
Right.
Munster, M-U-N-S-T-E-R. Is this a good position for me?
Yes. So my name is Jeffrey Hope. I'm a journalism instructor at the New England School of Communications, which is where this interview is being conducted. I'm here with Larry Ayotte, who is shooting the video for us. It's January 20, 2016, and Mr. Cole is 90 years old, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
So we'll need your name and your date of birth.
Galen L. Cole, born November 29th, 1925, here in Bangor, Maine.
And your branch of service?
And I served in the infantry during the war, followed by service in the, what was the second armored? I was in the, well,
5th Armored?
I served with the 5th Armored. I fought with the 5th Armored and served as a tank, in the maintenance battalion. I was transferred at the end of the war to the 2nd Armored and served in the maintenance battalion and grew to the rank of sergeant.
And that was your highest rank?
Right.
And this was World War II.
Right.
So we'll start at the beginning. What was it like to be a teenager in your final years of high school with the war going on?
It became of a good deal more concern as we went along. Early in the war, I drove truck cleaning up trash and so forth. We had drives every weekend in Bangor, and the school kids and the adults and so forth. We were all part and parcel. We knew about rationing of food, gasoline rationing as well, but we felt the war would be over before we graduated from high school. Not so. And within days of graduation from high school, I was drafted along with thousands of other Maine boys into the for basic training down at Camp Blanding in Florida, and we went down on troop trains from Massachusetts, from Camp what's the big one outside Boston, toward Worcester.
Camp Blanding is where you ended up, but maybe you're talking about Fort Devens?
Fort Devens, yeah, exactly, right.
So going backwards, do you remember talking to your parents about this whole war? Do you remember any discussions with them, what this was all like?
I had grown in the Coles Express to the point where the drivers were listening to me on dispatching and so forth as a kid in high school. So I guess I knew my dad had something for me. And later, when I got home from the service, and he died early on, my two older brothers, 10 and 12 years older than I, voted for me to become president of the company. So they did see that I had something going. Back to your question, though. Yes, we realized the article that I wrote, and the night Bangor beat Bucksport in the tournament, and another couple originally from Enfield, their son was the star of the Bucksport team. I was just the center for Bangor, and an average guy, but having won that game for Bangor, my mother was some taken, and the article that went on to say within days or weeks we were being called up for the service. We had signed up in when playing basketball that winter for the military, the day you reached 18, or within 10 days, I think you had to go and sign up. We knew at that point we were basically where we were going as well. 90% of the boys were going into the infantry, because following the Battle of the Bulge, especially so, and yes, starting on the beaches of France in June of the previous year, and then the Battle of the Bulge only weeks before the Battle of the basketball tournaments, the thousands of troops that we lost again in Belgium, we knew we were potentially on the front lines, and you better believe we paid attention, and we were supposed to learn how to handle that M1 rifle, Garand rifle, blindfolded, every part. There's something over 100 pieces, and I learned to do that in the dark.
Let me come back to the rifle.
Okay.
So what is it like for the 18-year-old from Maine? Do you recall discussions of the war and the fact that you felt like you might be heading to Europe?
Not especially, because everyone was in the war at that point. You know, it was part and parcel. It was as much as I've been told that my dad had tears after I went in the service, but he and I never discussed the war for one moment before or after I got home from the war. He was just so pleased that I made it. And of course, I was after what happened to me, and I had smarts enough to that my mother taught all 7 of her children to acquiesce to any reasonable request by anyone senior to you, and William Bill Galladay was certainly that to me, and he wanted his old seat back.
Right. Well, yeah, we'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah.
Are you okay with that fact that you and your father did not discuss it?
I guess I now wish we had, but you know, I didn't discuss it hardly with anyone, because the Air Force, those that served in the Air Force, did they have it rough? One of a good friend of mine up in Enfield served in the submarine corps, in those submarines. Hey, if that wasn't tougher than the infantry, I don't know what was, because we were losing submarines by the dozens in those days.
Yep. How do you actually get drafted? What happens? Is it come by telegram or mail?
At that point, as I recall, we got noticed by the local draft board, and went over to the Brewer Auditorium, where we signed up, and then within a few weeks went in for physicals to be sure we passed the physicals and all, and then we just sat tight and got a notice or two, and were called up, and there were at least 100 of us that morning that boarded a passenger train from Bangor on June 18th, I believe it was, and we were railed down to Portland, where we actually were sworn in to be members of, and to defend the United States and serve faithfully and all in the military.
Frightening at that point?
No, because again, thousands had done it before us, and no, it didn't really get frightening until we got overseas. The sergeant that greeted us when we got off the train, off that troop train in
Camp
Camp Blanding, put the fear of what we were about to get into to full strength, and it started raining, And he was just as tough as the rest of us, and we didn't have any raincoats on. He stood there and he continued barking at us and telling us what to expect. And then it was proven how tough he was, because you'll get a pass on some weekends if you've done things as you should have. But if one fellow in the 200 group of 200 has a dirty rifle, that gigs the whole other 199, and no one gets a pass. And beyond that, you will be out around your huts, which were built on sand, so grass would grow, hay would grow out of that, and you'd cut tall grass, holding it with one hand and cutting it with your bayonet with the other. Now, if that doesn't put you down to about 0 on any pecking order, I don't know what does.
Did you ever come to appreciate him?
Probably not at that time. It seemed like he went overboard. But looking back, I think he had already seen some service, and he was trying to. He was a black boy, but meant business, and we listened, and we learned.
What else do you remember from Camp Landing?
Well, within a few weeks of training, well, we learned several things. Learned how to fire a rifle. I especially remember, after probably 2 months there, I think we were scheduled for 13 weeks. Maybe it was 16 weeks, and they cut it down to 13 when the Battle of the Bulge took place. But I remember the forced drill marches, especially. We would go on a 16-mile hike with our knapsacks, probably 25 pounds in them. And I remember hiking along, and we 18-year-olds were in there with the 38-year-olds. Quite a difference. And those 38-year-olds were really having a tough time. And you knew whenever they fell out, because typically that rifle butt would hit the concrete. You couldn't have thrown it to the ground any harder. And the orders were, keep marching. The aides will take care of those fellows. Your job is to keep marching. But I remember that one of those nights, and every hour, every 50 minutes, we got 10 minutes off, and to lay back and rest. And I fell asleep, and the whistle blew, and hey, get back in line and march, which I did. But I had slipped my shoulders out of the knapsack, and I was probably 20 paces down the road before I realized what I had done. So now I got to run back and get my knapsack on and then catch up again. That became difficult to do after 10 or 12 miles of hiking and so forth. But it was that kind of stuff that got us prepared and ready to go overseas. And I went overseas with several members of my basketball team and other competing basketball teams and friends from Brewer and John Bapps, and so it could have been a lot worse.
What was it like to see these men that were 20 years older? Was that an odd experience?
Yes, it was odd. It was especially odd to me to think they were so out of condition. But of course, we who were playing sports were in such great condition, made a difference. There were lots of the 18-year-olds who had problems, as did the 38, but not to the degree that the 38-year-olds. And so many of those 38-year-olds did not finish basic training. They were transferred to other desk jobs and so forth.
Did that scare you at all, seeing that these older people, did it send any kind of message of what shape the U.S. was in, that they were now relying on older recruits? Did you think about that at all?
Well, I knew why they were now depending on older recruits is that the war had become such a desperate situation, and if those fellows had to be called up, we were really in war at full strength, and those 38-year-olds who did go overseas tended to be almost father figures to we younger fellows. So that was okay. But probably the biggest shock to me going overseas was, and before going overseas, I out on those sand dunes and so forth where we slept and spent time at night, the sand fleas got at my legs. Didn't realize it at the time, and that they're such tiny little critters. You don't really know it until they penetrated the skin, and you start itching, and then you start bleeding, and so forth. And it takes a while to get rid of them. So I was called back and went to the hospital to get those legs healed. And I was in the hospital, I'm guessing, several weeks. And by this time, my outfit had finished and graduated and gone. So I joined another outfit that was halfway along, and didn't know a soul in that outfit. These were people who had come from wherever, any place in the United States of America, and never met another soul that I knew until after the war was over. And to go overseas alone, knowing not a single solitary soul, the one thing I really learned on the boat, we went over on the Louis Pasteur, a French luxury liner, 5,500 people, I think, and we were down, most of us were down in the hold that wasn't more than 5 feet off the ground, and we slept in that hold with what we call fat sacks, one body to another fellow's head. There wasn't, if you had to go to the John, you had to fall out of the thing, and now to get back in was even more or to find where your sack was. But in any event, we went over unescorted, and I think 3.5 days to England, to Liverpool, England, if I recall correctly, and still, knowing no one, taking in no nourishment on that 3.5 days, because I was seasick from the moment we left, right in the middle of the winter, and we saw some of England and went on down to Southampton and took a smaller ferry across to Le Havre, France, and and from there we were heading for replacement depots. Replacement depots carried troops, held troops for the infantry divisions, especially, and we followed along behind them, maybe 10, maybe 30 miles, whatever it might have been, and then typically, I think, on a seniority basis for your entering the replacement depots, you were called up, whatever MOS you carried, and probably 80% were riflemen, pure and simple, and you had your knapsack, and you had your rifle, and you had, don't recall now, I guess we had some ammunition. We surely had some ammunition, but in my case, I was called up to the 5th Armored Division. That seemed rather strange, because I was a rifleman, and yet I liked the idea of riding in a half-track. And General Patton called the half-track the greatest invention of World War II. There was something over 100,000 of those units made. and he called it the greatest unit because it looked the part. It was made of steel all the way around, but anything starting with a 50 caliber machine gun would whittle its way through the sides. A mortar shell would take out the entire, a hand grenade thrown in over the top. And when we traveled with a, at night, we traveled with a canvas laid out in yay fashion, and all had it in our lap at all times. And the assistant squad leader who sat back with us was responsible for making the call. When you heard 1, 2, 3, on 3, you were to throw, all of us were to throw our hands up, and anything that had come in would hopefully go out on the count of 3 onto the ground. It wasn't a foolproof procedure, but it was helped. But
Let me come back to the half track.
okay, go ahead.
I want to go backwards for a second.
All right.
Tell me about the M1 and training with the M1. What was that like?
Well, it gave you an awfully sore shoulder. I remember that because it had a good stiff kick to it, and the only way you could really be accurate, and you needed to be accurate because you didn't want to get gigged for not being able to handle that machine and not take out a target. And you had a black and blue shoulder often from it. But it was considered the best gun of World War II, I was told then, and I have read since. It was a powerful machine. It wasn't big enough to go through a half-inch steel, but it would take out lots of troops, and it would reach up to 300 yards.
Did you get to the point where you'd feel odd without it? Did you really get used to having it with you?
You get to not odd without it because it was so damn heavy, but I got to feel very comfortable with it, and I needed it. And especially, I was on guard duty for immediately at the end of the war, on guard duty 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, protecting telephone equipment and so forth in residential areas, and it was a comfortable thing to have with you then, and to carry, because it said something to the Germans, it said something to others that I never needed to fire it, but it was well, maybe not unlike a policeman today. That gun and so forth says something to the public.
And your particular rifle, you'd never had to fire, or you didn't have a chance?
Yes, I did the day on a couple of occasions, but especially the day that we were attacked by the German 88 shell in Alberslau, Germany.
Okay, we'll come back to that then. Going back to your training, you had some additional training, intelligence and reconnaissance. Is that right? Back at how to operate a radio?
No. No, I didn't, but that little booklet that I showed to you, my good friend who played center for Winslow, and he spoke French, and he was he went to Camp Blanding at about the same time I did. But I got to know him well following, but no, the only training I got was to handle that rifle, and even again in the pitch dark, to take it apart and put it back together.
Did you get pretty good at it?
Didn't feel I was ever going to really need that, and I didn't really need it. So you I don't know how good is, but it was part of the training, and it really made an impression of this is your best friend. Protect him, and he'll protect you.
So you're sent to Europe, and tell me about being assigned to the 5th Armored.
Well, I was following, I was in a replacement depot. right from France, and I was in the 18th replacement depot, and followed that along for, seemed like weeks. Probably it wasn't more than 2 weeks when I was called up. We got mail those days, but I never got any mail because I didn't stay there long enough, and they weren't the greatest. They wanted to send your mail to your permanent outfit, so I was called up to go to the 5th, and was kind of pleased because again I was going to be riding, and thought for sure those tanks offer more protection and so forth. And we even had a machine gun in our half-track. Now, following the war, following the fighting there in Elvislaw, I realized how dangerous a half-track was, because it drew in the firepower, the biggest firepower that the Germans had, and the shell that hit our half-track was an armor-piercing shell, which, had it hit the tank, would have even gone through any of our tanks, dead center. And it went over the top of the tanks and came down and hit the hood of our half-track, right on through and right out the back end, those bodies included, on its way and down the road under the next half-track, which followed us.
Mm. Yep. Well, we'll talk about that day in a minute. Tell me about, so you're in Europe, and is this new food for you, or was it the same C rations and K rations that you'd had?
It was basically the same food. Sometimes you got a little better food than you did at other times. I was never a chow hound as such. I had a couple of disadvantages, though. I never drank coffee. I didn't like that powdered milk, though I had it on my cereal and so forth. But I had the big advantage, not being a chow hound. Food was not all that important to me. To some of those fellows, though, they would kill off any number of chickens, hens, whatever. If a deer crossed the road, that was the end of him, and so forth. So I'm probably not a good example of that. What I am a good example of, though, is mail call, because in the outfit I went to in the 5th Armored, right off quick, several of my buddies were not able to read or write. They were from Arkansas and Tennessee and so forth. And so they were calling on me to write their letters home to their sweethearts and their wives and so forth. And then when mail would come, I would read it. I wasn't alone in doing that, but the few of us who could read fluently. And the thing that really bothered me was, though, their excitement of getting mail and me never getting mail. I want to think it was 72 days, and we had mail call, not every day when battle, but every day otherwise, because that was the highlight of the day. And everyone's excited, that gets so excited when they get their mail, they don't stop to realize that you didn't get any mail. That's your problem. No one's writing to you then, I guess. Well, that fact, that thought passes through your mind after a while too. After the war, I was smart enough to quickly realize, and in fact, I needed to go on to. Yes, I was with the 5th Armored only a few weeks before getting wounded myself up there in Elvislaw, and I went to the hospital, to a hospital which had been a school, and I was there 2 or 3 weeks before getting back to my 5th Armored again, and I came back through the replacement depot, and if it wasn't the 18th, And I was smart enough to inquire, and the lady said, yes, she remembered me. There were just dozens of letters. Well, that made me feel pretty good, but not one of them were, she had sent them on to the 5th Armored Division, as she learned where I had been assigned. So I was quite anxious to get back to the 5th, even with the fighting going on. Those letters meant almost as much as life itself. And I met up with the 5th again up on the Elbe River, just north of Berlin. And our 5th Armored was the closest American division to Berlin, and we would have been called up first up in the town of Stendal on the Elbe River. Had the U.S. been called to invade Berlin, as it worked out, and I've read since, and I had communication even with Mrs. Eisenhower. I wrote her a letter, and she wrote back to me. I don't have it now, but I was thanking her for what her husband did by learning, as he knew, of course, what happened at the Potsdam Conference in the spring of '45, with the French and the English and the Russians, and it was the last meeting that Roosevelt had with them, decided how they were going to divvy up, how they were going to who was going to win what territory, and he couldn't see that we were going to get one more square foot of land, no matter by invading Berlin. And though the Germans really preferred the Americans because we weren't nearly as vicious as were the Russians, but the fact that we weren't going to pick up any more land, and it was estimated we would lose 100,000 troops. The 5th, the lead division, ready to go, and listening to the Russians battle there for 2 weeks. It was rather pleasant, if you will, but with concern, because had the Russians needed help, we would have been the 1st Division in there.
So a very worrying time.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Chef, can you stop and change battery?
So we're back. We had to change batteries. Same interview, same time.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a point where you really felt like perhaps your parents weren't writing to you?
No, and I never really lost faith in that, because there weren't that many replacements coming aboard. So that just put us. I don't know that I knew another replacement. I was in an outfit that my squad. I guess my lieutenant was the next, but the lieutenants didn't get down to the privates to have any conversations, or at least most of them didn't. Mine didn't, certainly. Wonderful man, but so you just did the best you could do, and everyone kept hearing from the Red Cross, oh, "Are you writing? Are you writing? Are you writing?" Because I was complaining, and those complaints were going forth. Yeah.
What did letters, once you got them, what was the news from back home? Do you recall?
My first letter came after I returned from the hospital, when we were up on the Elbe River. And I was given, there was nothing special going on that day, as I recall, and I had nearly 100 letters. And I was so furious, I didn't bother to check dates or whatever. I just grabbed it on, that these people are alive, and that obviously I meant more to them than I thought I did, even. And I don't know that I ever digested them, all of but that's beside the point. Probably probably the happiest day of my life, because finding that I was alive following that shell coming through and by switching seats, I felt an obligation to William Bill Galladay and God, and I have made mention of that in my mind and to my wife and my family thousands of times, that God must have had something in mind for me, that I lived and I lost my entire squad. I was the only one ever to return to the 5th Armored from my squad, and
Well,
5 of them were killed.
We'll have to start at the beginning on that one, so give me a
No,
moment. Give me
yeah.
a moment.
Yeah, no,
So back to the mail. Do you recall writing for the other people what you would write for the people from Arkansas and these other men?
oh, like only what they told me. Yeah, word for word what they told me. I never I don't recall. Oh, I might have gotten to know someone well enough to put a little, but it wasn't. It would take a month often, because they did get into that email, which was a lot faster near the end of the war. But no, I would just read what they had received to them, and then they would dictate, and probably never was much more than a page or so. I wasn't going to write them love letters for them, go on and on. But that was the way it was. That was a difficult time of my life.
Did they kind of sugarcoat what was going on, or were the letters actually accurate? If I were to read a letter, was it an accurate portrayal?
Well, you were under strict rules and regulations of what you could say. So sometimes I would correct them even. We can't say that. It won't go through security. And you never could say where you were or whatever, and you never could say how bad the fighting was. You were quite limited. So they'd be asking how their kids were doing, or write me and tell me about such and such. Those kinds of things were quite. But I don't recall one of them ever saying to me, "Gee, Galen, you're not getting any letters. I really feel for you." They weren't that sophisticated. They were out for themselves, and especially I remember one Southerner said to me, "Cole, if there's anything worse than a Republican, it's anything worse than a Yankee. It's a Republican Yankee."
Wow.
And that, somewhat in a joking way, but they were still fighting the Civil War.
What did you think of that?
Ignorance. Yeah.
Let's talk about a couple of other things related to being over there. You remember the shower wagon?
Oh, do I remember that? I remember that almost every time I go in a shower today. And I go in a shower, maybe now not every day, but I used to go almost twice a day even. But yes, the fact that there were no showers, there was no running water. We did in Germany put the Germans out of their homes and took over their homes. And if they had running water or a pump or whatever or stove, we got a few showers once in a while. But by and large, yeah, I can see this 6x6 with shower heads on either side, and I don't know that there were even any curtains on it. So you saw 10 bodies washing themselves madly. I mean, no one was wasting a second. And sometimes you didn't wash your hair, your head get wet, but you weren't going to waste much time up there. You were going to clean other parts of your body that hadn't been cleaned maybe in a month or more. So think of that, and think of the luxury that we have here in this country today, that almost everyone has, to be able to take a shower, clean their body as slowly and as long as they wish. But they were on timers, and when a guy gets shoved out of his shower and only had half his body washed, hey, shame on you. Now you're going to run around and need to get the other half washed sometime if you can.
Did you get an Army-issued piece of soap, or what happens?
Yes, there were. I don't recall whether they often had those little hotel-size cakes, as I recall, but I really don't know. My guess is it was either that or it was a one that could take two hands almost to hold. Is about the way the military would supply you soap.
Okay, we had to stop for a moment just for lighting, but we're back, and it's the same day and same interview. Let's talk about spring 1945, April 2nd. You are in the Halftrack, and I guess before that, we should probably begin with riding around in the Halftrack and being asked to move your seat. So
Okay.
tell us about that.
We were preparing. We were typically either fighting or preparing to fight, and of course it took time to re-equip a tank and a half-track to get ready to fight. You couldn't fight 24 hours a day or 24 hours period. Typically you'd run out of ammunition and so forth. We were in the little town of Hulls, H-U-L-L-S, Hulls, Germany, preparing to go north, where we crossed the Rhine River in the town of Wessel. We pronounce it Wiesel, I believe, W-E-S-S-E-L-L. And we crossed the Rhine there on pontoon bridges. It was lit up brighter than any airport you can imagine in the world. That was to keep the German aircraft away, I guess, and so that we could shoot them down for miles. We went across the Rhine, and within another day or so was when we were taken on. Getting ready to go across the Rhine River in Wessel. And there is an interesting story. My best friend in the half-track met and married a German girl while I was with him there in what town did I say? The first one I used.
In Hulls?
Hope. Not Hope. What did I say here?
You mean Hulls?
Hulls.
Yeah.
Hull. Isn't that amazing?
Now, who are we talking about?
At 90 years old, 10 seconds ago, it was difficult to come up with.
Who are we talking about? Your friend?
Cliff
Lamb?
Cliff Lamb,
Yes.
right. Clifford Lamb met. In fact, that is maybe the most interesting story of all, and I'll tell it to you fellows by yourselves if you want, how he met her, how he married her, the lovely place they had out in Washington State that we visited, but back up to wherever you want to.
So Private First Class William Galladay
Right.
at some point comes to talk to you.
Okay. The morning we were getting ready to ship out, we all were putting our stuff aboard the half-track, our half-track. I knew well enough. I had met Bill Galladay a day, maybe 2 days before then. I'd only known him like a couple of days. He had just come back from a hospital trip where he had frozen his feet and was rejoining us. I didn't get to know him then, really, but knew who he was, and he knew me as Cole, and I knew him as Galladay, and so forth. And we're basically all in the half-track. I'm in my seat that I'd been using on the ditch side, about midship, and Galladay arrived late, stood at the rear of the half-track, and said to me, Cole, he's rear of the half-track, he's sitting midship, Cole, I hate to do this to you, but he said, I had that seat that you're in all the way through France and Belgium and Holland and Luxembourg, and I'm superstitious. That's just about the way he said it. Not that I had to move, but there was a strong urging. Well, it didn't take me long, and here I am with a bunch of new fellows anyway, and I don't want to be a sissy, but on the other hand, that's a reasonable request, and my mother is speaking to me. So I said, fine, Bill. And now I start looking, where is there an empty seat? Because we're about full. And as it happened, just about opposite where he was sitting, midship, there is an empty seat. And I said, fine. So I just picked up myself. I don't know that I had, probably I had my belt and canteen and so forth there. And I moved that over to the other side. But we would be as close as you are to the other side of this table. That's why we sat and rode.
Is it a bench or is it a seat? What is it?
I'm sorry.
It
It was a bench. They were cushioned. There was a long metal slab, if you will, and individual cushions, and we have down at the museum. We have an identical, absolutely identical to that unit in our museum. I think the back is a slab of cushioned canvas and so forth, with a canvas covering that's used for your back. And I want to think that the individual seats, they were the same material, but cushioned only.
Let's move it on.
And canvas.
Whoop, hold on. It's all right. You're okay.
I was trying to be discreet, and I ended up making a mess.
There.
We're rolling still.
Okay. Want to back up?
I'll wait till Larry
We
to
can,
move.
I'm willing to back up if you want to. I might do a better job than I.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I wanted to hear about the seat.
Rolling still.
Okay. Should I make a mark on it, or you?
Jim can show you the seat,
Yeah, we'll see it.
and you can take a picture of it. That unit is in the museum right now, with the rear door open, and I'm sure I was sitting when I moved closer than you are to that blue jacket after moving. So that shell just happened to come in right down the.
So this is you're saying it was really your mother is speaking to you?
Well,
yes.
yes,
You're just a good kid from Maine.
That's right. I'm wanting to. I'm not wanting to be pushed around, but I'm not wanting to create a problem either. I'm trying to be a decent, honorable Yankee, if you will. I probably am with more Southerners, but no, I don't know that even. But we had an ample number of Southerners with us. Yeah.
How well do you remember that day?
What do I remember?
How well do you remember that day?
Probably better than any day that I lived in my life.
Can you still hear his voice, do you think? Him talking to you?
Yes. Yeah. And there's almost not a day goes by that I don't remember my shock when I came to enough to realize here I am whole, out of the half-track.
Well, we should explain what happened. So you.
Let me change
Okay.
media.
Okay, we had to change media, but we were doing the same interview.
Okay.
So we have talked about the changing of the seat and what happened then. So lead us to April 2nd.
Okay. Okay. We had crossed the Rhine River on April 1st, and we were traveling along on not the interstate, In fact, not many vehicles were traveling the interstate because they were drawing more firepower and so forth. And furthermore, the bridges were being knocked out. The Germans were taking out their own bridges, of course, to slow us down. So we were traveling along. We probably had, excuse me, we traveled at night. Probably maybe got 30 minutes of sleep that night. I'm not sure, because you got that canvas on your lap, and if someone wants to take out a dozen men, I can't think of anything easier. And the fact that we had been told about that possibility, but in any event, I recall we stopped to have breakfast, and K rations, C rations, and certainly there were no fresh eggs or anything like that being cooked, because we knew we were in the near the German front. But we continued on up through to the little town of Elversla, probably, I'm guessing, town of 5,000 maybe. Both sides of Hamden in the old days, maybe. And we came to a halt. And the commander of the tanks, a first lieutenant, and our platoon leader, Hank Stevens, commander of our platoon, the 46th, the first platoon of the 46th Armored Infantry Battalion, were up ahead of us. And we were there for an hour or so. And our sergeant, who sat up beside, I guess I should say, the driver, and the assistant squad leader sat there was a third seat in the middle. The three of them are facing the oncoming traffic. The rest of us are facing each other. And our sergeant, I remember him saying, he'd been with the 5th all the way from the previous July, when the 5th landed on Omaha Beach, on through the fighting. He said, "I don't like this. This war is nearly over, and this situation is not appropriate."
Did he feel exposed?
He felt they didn't know as much as they should have known about the situation. Another half hour, everybody mount up, and they did. Those who were wouldn't have been many out of the half-track anyway, of the half-tracks, but it could have been to urinate or whatever, have a cigarette. And of course, in those days, they sat smoking in close quarters too, as long as they didn't burn down the bedding. But in any event, we started moving forward, and we moved very slowly for off and on, walking speed probably, for up through the town of Elversla, the village, and a sharp right turn there by a church. I mean, very sharp. You couldn't have possibly passed 2 trucks. It was that tight a turn. And we continued on at walking or trotting speed, and stopped and saw some women closing their windows and buckling their blinds, because they hadn't seen, and we knew then that this was not normal traveling. But we're there to take on whoever is in our way, and we got the tanks with us and so forth. So we get roughly a half mile out of town, toward the town of Walbeck, and the town east of Munster, Munster, which is probably a city of 300,000 or 400,000 people, and there was fighting going on up there. And nothing is happening except we're traveling, and then we come to a little turn. We're in the farming country, in the fields. It would do a little left-hand turn that comes back to a little right-hand turn, and then a straightaway for probably a mile. And we got to the straightaway, and we're probably, maybe all of our vehicles, the tanks, there were like 3 of them, I believe, ahead of our 3 half-tracks, and they're spaced also. Some firing starts coming in, machine gun fire and rifle fire and all, and then some big gun fire. And probably, the 10th big gun fire was the one that hit we had come around into a straightaway a mile long, and that 88 gun had a straight angle at us. We didn't realize there was anyone down there even. They'd been waiting for us probably a few days. And they fired, and it wasn't the first shot. In fact, I recall seeing, we were beside a railroad track, a chunk of railroad track being busted by a shell striking it. That's powerful stuff. And very soon, though, within a couple of minutes, this shell came through our half-track, and body parts and helmet parts and so forth were. I had taken a few shots with my rifle behind some haystacks and so forth, because you know, and it's a good chance to be sure that baby is doing what it's supposed to do, and they would hide many times. I mean, anything you can dream of, they were 2 steps ahead of that. The Germans were clever. I dare say that the average German soldier could do twice the work than an average American soldier, because he had been trained and he had been fighting for a couple of years by then. That gave him huge advantages. So you didn't want to give him any more than you had to. But that shell came through our half-track, and on the right-hand side, within inches of the gasoline tank, because the gasoline tank was located just behind the passengers' backs, and it cleaned out all of those soldiers and got our sergeant in the neck, hit him in the neck and decapitated him, and the rest of the bodies probably didn't waver more than an inch or 2 on their bodies going down through. I was able to tell a party here just last week that the soldiers on that side did not suffer. They were killed instantly, and that gave some comfort to people, and has to others that I have spoken to. Those of us who survived got shrapnel, typically steel bits and pieces. Some got broken eardrums. I have a metal Stapes bone and a plastic Stapes bone in both of my ears, which the government wouldn't spend the money to respond to. But we then waited because the fighting stopped shortly thereafter, and again that shell I know was an armor-piercing shell, because otherwise it would have taken out the entire. If when it hit had been the first thing that it hit, would have taken out the entire squad of us, and it was absolutely an armor-piercing shell, because it took out the bodies of those people. And I went back to the hospital with a soldier in the half-track ahead of us, and it had creased his helmet. It was on its way down, and he often said it saved his life, and I said, it was damn near killed you, because it knocked him out, of course, in that inch and a half of space, but who can say? In any event, we do know that when it hit the ground, the shell hit the ground before it got to the next half-track, and blew a tire on the front of the half-track. So that was the big fighting.
Now, did you have to exit the vehicle?
You're right.
Yeah.
Right. As instinct will tell you to do, for fear of more shelling coming on, and Cliff Lamb, who was then the machine gunner, he was up on the machine gun, which sat in the center of the table here, and the gun had jammed. He was using that machine gun into the woods and so, because we were getting small arms fire too, and he was clearing the gun to fire it again when that shell came through, and it ripped half his shoulder off. He recovered quite well and could raise his arm. Last time I saw him, he's now deceased, but he could raise his arm up to shoulder level at least. So those of us who were still alive got out of the half-track and went gradually back to the aid station, which was at the Hagemann house, a German family just south of the town, a big farm, and a good chance to pull the vehicles off the aid vehicles and lay out on the yard. It was a decent spring day, probably 60 degrees, I would guess. And then we went back to the hospitals that were designated for us along the way, and stayed in that hospital, which was a former school, for a couple of weeks. In fact, I was there, as I recall, at the hospital when President Roosevelt died, that we learned that he, and of course, it was then that we knew the war was, or felt that the war was only a few days over. A few days but over. Hitler, on the other hand, tried to rally the Germans that with Roosevelt gone, hey, we can win this war.
Going backwards, you at some point realized that trading the seat with Galladay made a difference. When did that occur to you?
When I was on the ground, when I made my first promise, no thought in my life has ever been expounded like that. Here I am alive, and I had swapped seats at the urging of Bill Galladay, and God must have had something in mind for me, that I'm alive, and if I live to get home from this war, I'm going to do my best to leave my community and my fellow man better than I found them. And 45,000 kids that have come into that museum and interviewed veterans. Since then, the now 450,000 people who have come into that museum from all over the world, and half of them know that story because our volunteers tell it. Some of them tell it far better than I can, and tell it, of course, more often. It's promises made and promises kept is what our museum is about. And freedom is not free.
Tell me about the houses that were converted. You were with Cliff Lamb after he was wounded. Where did they take him to?
In Cliff Lamb's case, it depended how seriously you were wounded. Cliff's case was quite serious. They had stopped the bleeding and so on, but he told me subsequently. I never saw him again until well after the war was over. I wrote to him and all, but in fact, an interesting story. He married this girl, this German girl, whose father ran a shoot, what do you call it? Made stained glass windows there in the little town of Hulls, and he went back over as a teacher and a professor, and his father-in-law built a third story on his house for them to be, and they spent several years there. But that doesn't answer your question. Ask you a question again, please.
Where was he taken? Was he taken
Okay.
to a house?
He was, yeah. The last I saw of him was while that German lady was cleaning the wounds of all of us. He was one of the first to be taken by ambulance, and it wasn't until after the war was over that I learned, as he told me, that he went back to England, and he was operated on in England, and then later he was sent back to the States.
Can you explain how a German woman came to help you in cleaning wounds? Because people might not be aware that that kind of thing happened.
That probably was the greatest salvation to my way of living and the things my mother had taught me, of anything that had happened to me since, or before or since. That woman welcomed, if you will, 20 vehicles in her yard, and she was out there with her little apron on, and she didn't stand 5 feet tall, and would go back in her house and bring out clean sheets and water and so forth. It amazed me that our aides were allowing her to do all that, but they were busy too. It was, and the love that woman was showing was probably as good as the medical attention that Cliff Lamb was getting. I don't know, but I was so I didn't ship out of there until later that afternoon with the fellow whose helmet got creased. We were on the tail end. We were making out okay, but I wanted to get back, and I did. And my brother-in-law and I got over there and met them. And
You found her.
she had died only a couple of years before. But I found her daughter, who was every bit like her mother, and who was living in the farmhouse. And the daughter now, see, this is like 20 years later before I got back over there. And the daughter had 4 children. I think she's later had 5. About the first thing we had to do is go down to the graveyard to see the wonderfully kept graves and so forth that my grandmother was buried. I made 4 or 5 trips there and brought some of their children here on at least 2 occasions. But what was most impressive to me, I invited my wife and I and brought our family. There was a wonderful lodge only a few miles away, and we brought them there for dinner, the whole family. Well, they all couldn't come immediately because they had the cows to milk, and they had only girls in the family, and so some of the girls had to stay and milk the cows. But they came along, and after it was all over that night, we all had our nice thoughts back and forth, and some of the little girls couldn't understand why there were 3 forks and 2 knives and so forth. They were right off the farm. And the youngest of the daughters, in fairly good English, she was probably 10 years old, she said to me, "Mr. Cole, my grandmother," we were talking about this, "my grandmother would not be able to stand around and not help people. She had white, well-washed sheets and so forth, and so forth. And what a wonderful woman she was. And I said, but dear, you didn't know your grandmother. She said, no, but my mother told me about my grandmother. And if she told me that, that's how it was.
It didn't matter that you were Americans.
Exactly. No, they weren't for the war. Her husband was up on the Russian front and got wounded up there. No, not the grandmother's, but the daughter's husband was up on the Russian front. The grandfather was dead.
Must have been surprising to see her.
Yes, it was. And that farm is still in the hands of her daughters today. And what a I've got pictures of that. You wouldn't believe. It's $1 million front. It was brick then, probably 200 years old, the brick, and it's brand new brick today. I should have brought those pictures with.
Tell me about your recovery after this.
I didn't. Well, okay. I got back to the 5th Armored, which was probably we weren't more than 40, 50 miles away from where the hospitals were, and they were up in the little town of Stendal, Germany, and I got my mail and so forth, and almost immediately the war was over. I think I got back around the 1st of May, and the 8th of May the war was over in Europe, and probably the 9th of May we shipped back our whole division. We thought we were going to Holland because the word was that there were problems there and that we were being shipped to. That wasn't so, and I never heard any more. Because down that far in the pecking order, you just do what you're told.
Do you remember where you were when it was announced the war was over?
Yeah, we were still in Stendal. We were just packing up to leave. Oh no, when the war was, I'm sorry, when the war was, yes, I was definitely in Stendal a couple of days prior to the war being over. In fact, the firing was much less in Berlin. We could tell it was about over with. And then we shipped back to the city of Erfurt, E-R-F-U-R-T, in central Germany, a large city, and there to maintain order because we had probably 100 trains a day coming through Erfurt of Russians, Germans, French, and all heading back, trying to get home. And some that really didn't want to get home, they wanted to fill their pockets with gold and so forth along the way. But we were there in the Hotel Erfurter, and they didn't need all of us there. So some of we younger fellows were sent out to protect the telephone lines. And I was on net guard duty 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And I was there for, I would think, a month or 6 weeks. And then we were surplus, and we were shipped down to a rest area in the German forest. And spent probably a month there, and I got a furlough, I recall, to England. Yes, I think these fellows weren't out looking to see the world either. So, and I got another one to Brussels, Belgium, and.
Now you should probably explain how is it the war ended and you did not get to. So we had
we may need to start back.
Right, we're gonna.
Okay.
We're back. We had to switch media again. Can you explain how the war ended, but you were not able to go home immediately?
Yes. Okay. Good. And I'll try to be brief because extending time reduces. I did hit a point or two there that seemed like it was right on and timely and so forth. I'll try to be swift here. The 5th, after Erfurt, And we then went down into the Gorings forest and preserve and wasted some time there. And there they were offering we young fellows an opportunity to go to Japan and a visit home along the way. Well, with what I'd been through, there was no way I was going to sign up to go to Japan to get a week at home on the way and get killed in Japan, probably. Those who were younger than I, who had no battle experience, were in still a weaker class, and they were the last opportunity after the rest of us turned the opportunity down to go home, and they got home, and they never did go to Japan because the war was over there. My lieutenant, Hank Stevens, he was called and taken back and joined the military police, and worked in France. I had no points, not enough points, though you get 5 points you get a point a month for being overseas. You get 5 points for a battle star. You get 5 points for a battle command, and I think I fit into 3 of those, but I still didn't have the 50 points to come home. So I'm in the group that apparently they read off as being ordnance oriented, and we one morning boarded the trucks down to the 2nd Armored, which was located near Frankfurt. And there when I got off the truck, the rest is, and the 2nd was to be an army of occupation, and with new troops, because the 2nd was senior to the 5th, and they went home. I didn't meet even the old timers there. I had to learn about that wrecker basically on my own and what others could show me. But the 5th, on the other hand, was going home as a unit by itself, and I didn't have points enough to go with it. But that later that fall, it was decided that they didn't need nearly as many in the Army of Occupation. Things weren't as rough as they thought they would be, and so we, as the replacement group for the 5th, for the replacement group for the 2nd Armored, we too were shipped home, and we traveled by our own conveyance down to Marseille, France, through Germany and down into France, and waited there for a little Liberty ship that we loaded up at Marseille, and I was sure my problems were over. Beautiful day, sun was shining until we got out by the Rock of Gibraltar on the way to New York, and it was rough. I never got out of my sack in the 18 days, but I had been smart enough to corral all of my fruit juices, and I had them well in hand. That's the only nourishment that I took on that entire trip. And our little ship lost off its anchor midway across the Atlantic, and it was 2 days that they tried to reclaim it, and it was hanging down there before they got permission to cut it and let us continue on to New York. To New York. And the morning, it was overcast. I'll remember that forever. And the Statue of Liberty come up board, and I really think that was the first time I was out of my sack. About the 6th sack up in a little ship that was made to carry cargo, and they had put bunks in it by the hundreds, but I got up there, and to see that Statue of Liberty that morning was the sight of a lifetime. We were home.
I don't think a lot of people are aware of the cleanup job that had to be done in Europe that you were a part of. Okay.
I wasn't responsible for it, but I was assigned to it. And with that wrecker, and he could trust me right off quick. It's sort of like I think I can trust you. I think you can trust me. You don't have to be around people forever and a day. And he and Don Colson trusts you implicitly, and if he does, I do. But where was I here?
Well, you had an entire highway you were in charge.
Okay, yeah, I was in an ordnance battalion, and those wreckers typically their biggest job was to replace engines out of those tanks. They were running aircraft engines. Can you believe that? In those tanks, we won that war with aircraft engines, and they all the air had to be sucked in under the tank and blown out. You could feel it, the football field away, the heat of. But in any event, that was the big job. But when the war is over, they're not worried so much about the tanks, and the orders are coming down now that your wreckers to, in our case, I was cleaning up the Autobahn between Mannheim and Frankfurt.
What did it look like?
What does what look like?
What did that area, the Autobahn, look like there?
You might go a mile and be clear as can be. Maybe every concrete bridge was down, but they had dozed so that you could get through and so forth. And we weren't involved in that anyway. But then there was some fighting that went on. There might be 3 German tanks, might be 5 American tanks, might be 1 CRUD, artillery guns, and you didn't have to be very smart to know an American unit from a German, because they were made differently. And my job was on Monday morning out of the little town of Wachtersbach, which was near Bad Orb, near Frankfurt. Every Monday morning I left with my helper, who happened to be close to an alcoholic, but he was a good welder. I remember that. In any event, every Monday morning we would leave and with some vehicles that had come into the ordnance battalion that either they had taken pieces off or which were not capable of being repaired to be run, and we took them down to the dump, which was American thousands of pieces of equipment there, and behind the wrecker we would have the Monday morning as many of those units as I dared to tow behind to go, and we'd just travel probably 25, 30 miles an hour to go down there. And then we would be assigned to what section of, especially we were involved near the Autobahns, and I guess maybe more of the heavy-duty fighting that took place there. But
so everything you saw was destroyed?
Yeah, right. Yeah, there was nothing whole that we came by. It was all destroyed, and we would pick it up, load it onto tank retrievers, and they would carry it off back down to the. So all week long we would stay at and they had facilities for traveling veterans everywhere, and you got really decent food there too. And then on Friday we would go back to Bad Orb and
Did you're coming across these various scenes of wreckage over and over again, did you have time to think about or wonder about what actually happened in any of those, or were you too busy just dealing with debris?
No, typically the war was over. They weren't set up like the movies at all. You know, this, there, 2 here, but if your life depended on, or if my life depended on it, I couldn't tell you what those units, who was fighting who and what, but I was to leave the German equipment alone. They'll clean that up on their own. We're simply going to clean ours up, and which we did. And we didn't clean it all up before we were called, and we closed shop, and the Second Armored also went home.
Another important event, you were told that you had to go see the concentration camp Buchenwald. Can you
Yes.
tell us about that?
This was before I went to the 2nd Armored. This is while I was on guard duty of the 5th. So that was a treat. Maybe I got out of a 12-hour shift for all I remember. It doesn't matter. But maybe it was my day off anyway. But I do remember getting those orders. Oh, and we found in the Hotel Erfurter, as soon as we got there, they had thousands of cameras, individual family cameras. All cameras had to be turned in and put in the safe of the hotel. So as soon as we GIs got a hold of those, and I was in the bottom of the pecking order as a private, we all had a camera and got some pictures of that stuff. The thing I remember the most, those old Germans were so inflicted, for lack of a better term, with cigarette, and pipe smoking. I can't believe, probably we have people like that. I never saw them here though, but we would have a meal in the hotel and be out on the sidewalk, and when a GI would throw a cigarette, or never stomped it out, throw it on the, those old Germans with the longest cane and the strongest arm, and if some younger person tried to get that butt, he'd get clobbered. And they did have respect for those old people. So those old fellows had, and they would put the tobacco in their little tin and use it. Now that doesn't answer your question. Let me go again.
So you were forced to go to Buchenwald.
Okay. So the word came down that within as soon as possible, and our unit was selected on such and such a date, and we traveled those damnable 6x6s. They won the war, really. They carried ammunition, they carried gasoline, they carried troops. They were right on, and they would go through the mud and crud. But to ride in them, the exhaust was something fierce. That gasoline, those fumes, especially when you let off on the throttle. But that's what we had to do. And really, I'd be sick for 3 or 4 hours before getting my head cleared up. But in any event, we got a memo every week at least, and that was we were going on such and such a date, and it was I'm guessing 100 miles, probably a 3-hour trip and 3 hours back, and we were going to be there 3 hours, I would guess, and seeing those bodies, seeing the carnage, seeing the facilities, and those gas chambers and the huge smokestacks. We got pictures of them there at the museum. Those that I took, and then I took my family back, and that was exciting. And my youngest granddaughter was like 11 at that point. She's now a doctor of pharmacy for Hannaford, and she's a trustee of the museum and is doing a great job.
Seeing what actually happened in the concentration camp, it must have affected you, or being able to envision what happened.
Yes, but we'd been indoctrinated by then. We'd seen things that Hitler had done before then too. Yes, it did, but I guess having seen it now several times, it's the way he was, and having read a bit about the way he operated, yes, seeing that first time was no question why we were there fighting, and we were prouder than ever to be Americans, and brought him to his knees.
Do you recall thinking that on the way back from that day?
Oh yes, and every time I visited there, it almost is like it's all over happening again, because they have rebuilt some of those housing units, pretty rugged stuff, and those gas chambers are still there, and the smokestacks are still there. Of course, the bodies have all been moved now. But how could a man be that unbelievably cruel. Was you just can't figure it.
Big picture, the entire experience, what did it do to you, your entire war experience?
Made me a man. I feel, and my good friend who played basketball against, it made him a man. He was wounded. He was a prisoner of war even. He played center for Waterville. I played center for Bangor. Within months, he's been through all of that, and he's back home and attending his next youngest brother's graduation from Winslow High School in less than a year. To go through all of that, hey, to some of them, they were maybe frightened to that point where they maybe never did recover. I never heard anyone, this PTSD, I never heard the word all the time I was in the service. But the idea was be as tough as you know how, and you got to beat these people, and you'll be back home and do your thing. So I've never lost huge amounts of sleep over it. I lose more now when they talk about the Third World War. If there is a Third World War, we all are susceptible to death. I mean, within minutes, hours, whatever, because today, even the bombs that struck Nagasaki, etc., are weaklings compared to those that are available today by the thousands. And I'm so frightened about going to Japan and getting caught up in a little more war. Hey, the Third World War will be 100 times, probably 1,000 times more serious than was World War II.
The museum that you helped found has enabled 45,000 students to meet with veterans of various wars and learn about their experiences. What would you like school children to know about your experience? Is there a lesson that you want them to think about?
Yes, that freedom is not free, and you may be called up to fight for our country's freedom at any time. And now they're talking about bringing the women into, I hope they never bring the women into the infantry. That would be a total disaster. It just does not add up at all. 18-year-old women and 18-year-old men bunking down together, living together. It just isn't possible for them to fight wars. And there are so many other things, of course, that a Third World War will do. Will annihilate some countries, possibly annihilate all of us.
Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Yes, I would like to think that the Coal Land Transportation Museum will survive for generations to come. That's my plan. I placed all of my assets, and my wife was willing to do the same. I kept my profit sharing plans and so forth, but Uncle Sam was going to, and the state of Maine, were going to take like 71 cents of every dollar when we sold the company, and I gave every penny of that, and it has increased in value since then, and we are committed to continue it without shrinkage, and we have certain rules and regulations to prevent that from happening, and bring children from Maine all over the state. We've now had over 700 busloads of Maine children visit our museum. I hope that'll be 7,000 someday. I'll not be around to see it, but if they continue the programs that we have and challenge those children. And these veterans continue to teach these children that freedom is not free. Then we have succeeded in making a difference. And that's the promise I made to my God the day I was holding Bill Galladay's, the day I lost Bill Galladay and was holding Cliff Lamb's hand outside that Halftrack in Elbeslaw, Germany.
Thank you, Mr. Cole.
Thank you for your nice questioning.